Hello everyone, and welcome back to Introduction to Ethics. In this video, we are going to look at two different theories of justice. One given to us by John Rawls, and the other given to us by Robert Nozick. All right, so let's jump in with Rawls. Rawls' article is entitled A Theory of Justice. And I think the best way to get started into what he has to say is by thinking about an imaginary scenario. So imagine that you wake up confused. You don't know who you are, and you are in a room with others in the same situation. They're confused, and they don't know who they are either. You don't know what race you belong to. You don't know what socioeconomic class you're in. You don't know your sex, religion, family history. It's like you've been memory wiped. Then you find out that you and these other people in the room have been tasked to create the most just society. What principles of justice do you choose? This story is basically the idea of what Rawls calls the veil of ignorance. So these people in this room with you, and you included, are behind a veil of ignorance. And what this means is um, you are in what's called the original position. Now, what Rawls is up to here is he's thinking that if we're going to create principles of justice, we don't want any kind of bias or self-interest to go into making up any of those principles, right? Because what's going to happen is people are going to start creating rules and principles and laws in that society that advantage them rather than actually distribute the resources among the citizens fairly. So Rawls thinks that it's necessary to start from what he calls the original position or the veil of ignorance. So as these people are constructing this society, even though they don't know a lot of particulars about themselves or like where they fall in the society, there are a few things that they are aware of. So first, they know enough about human nature and psychology to figure out things about human beings generally. So they have some kind of awareness of maybe the impacts of their decisions on other people, and just about how human nature works in general. And Rawls also makes much emphasis of these agents being rational agents. So when Rawls says that these agents are rational, there's two very specific things that he has in mind. First, when these people are rational, they prefer to have more rights, privileges, and securities than not. So if you were to take just people in general and kind of talk about them as just agents in general. If you were like a rational being, what would be the kinds of things that you would choose if you were trying to construct justice in a society? So the basic principle behind people being rational is that they would prefer to have more rights, privileges, and securities than not. And that seems reasonable, right? So we want to be liberal with the kinds of protections that we think people should have from one another, maybe even from the government, what kind of things that people are entitled to. So a rational agent is going to be liberal about those because, again, they just don't know what situation that they're in. And if you were in that kind of situation, you probably want to err on the side of, hey, I want to have more rights, privileges, and securities. And second, when people are rational, they would tend to choose principles that would help them accomplish their own ends, right? So you would choose those principles that would be to their benefit as much as possible. Now here, Rawls doesn't mean that people are egoistic or they're out to get what they want, but basically, think about the way that we choose to do things. We choose those actions that we think would benefit us as much as possible without, railroading other people. And so that's what Rawls has in mind when he says that people are rational. So rational agents in this case would choose to endow the citizens with more rights, privileges, and securities than not, and they would choose principles that would be as much to their benefit as possible. All right, so Rawls has two basic principles of justice. So Rawls thinks of justice as fairness, and that means that the principles of justice that are agreed to in uninitial situation that is fair. Part of this fairness arises from people who are making the laws. They don't know where they fall in that particular society, and the fairness arises out of the veil of ignorance. So the people who are in the veil of ignorance, Rawls thinks that what principles those people would choose as rational agents, those are the principles of justice that we have to abide by in order to have a just society. So the first principle is the maximum principle. Now, this principle is not necessarily an ethical principle, but it's just a rational principle that helps us figure out what to do in very uncertain scenarios. So here's how this works. So what you do is you survey all the possible outcomes of a situation. You examine the worst case scenarios, and then you choose the situation in which the least damage is done. So when you're thinking about taking a risk and you have the ability to choose between options, you want to choose um, that option that poses the least risk to you. Now, this maximum principle is important because remember, all of these agents don't know what their lot in life is, basically. And so, as they're choosing, like, what scenario would I want to befall me, they would, with their rational agents, choose a worst case scenario that's basically going to do the least damage to people. And so this is the idea behind the maximum principle. It's saying that, hey, in a worst case scenario, you want to pick that situation in which the least damage is done, or to put it a little bit more generally, you would choose that scenario within a society that would harm the worst off the least. Because think about it, that worst off could be you. Now, the maximum principle means that the rational choosers will abide by the difference principle. And the difference principle is that principle whereby the least well off, are to be given the greatest consideration in economic and social policy. So you can think about it like this. If the rational agent who doesn't know where they fall, if they're going to choose that worst case scenario that is going to do the least damage, when it comes to choosing principles of justice, or how do we construct an economic or social policy with the best benefits for all, you would give the greatest consideration to those who are least well off. Those people would be the ones, they've already are at a disadvantage, and we want to make sure that our policies don't disadvantage them any further. So here's a little bit more of what Rawls has to say on the difference principle. So the difference principle basically means that the wealthy can't use the poor as a mere means to obtain even more wealth. So Rawls does think that it is okay to have some inequality in a society, but what's not okay is that that inequality disadvantages the poor, or it makes them even worse well off. Any kind of just society abides by the difference principle. And in this difference principle, any kind of inequalities, they have to be managed so that those who are the least well off have the greatest benefit. So Rawls says social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they are to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged. He also says that the higher expectations of those better situated are just if and only if they work as part of a scheme which improves the expectations of the least advantaged members of society. So basically, the thought here is, with the difference principle, that even if there is inequality, what advantages the most well off has to advantage the least members of society as well. And in fact, it should improve their lives, maybe even a little bit further than it improves the lives of the already wealthy. So notice kind of the Kantian language here, the Kantian assumptions. So he's talking about rational agents and Kant thinks that rational agency is what is at the heart of ethical behavior. He's talking about the wealthy can't use the poor as a mere means just to gain wealth. We have to consider the ends of the least advantaged in society as well and think about their well-being. So the difference principle and the maximum principle are basically meant to show that if you start people off behind the veil of ignorance, they're going to choose policies that advantage the least well off in society, because hey, if you could end up there, you'd want to have some protections too. And it shows that in a just society, we want to construct our policies to not leave those who are least well off at a disadvantage. Okay, next we're going to think about Nozick's entitlement theory of justice. So Rawls thinks that justice has to do with fairness. Things start off from a level playing field, and if we're going to treat everybody in a fair way, that starts with making sure that nobody basically is at a severe disadvantage in the society. We privilege those who are worse off in a society to prevent great disparities of well-being. Now, Nozick has a bit of a different theory. So his position is called the entitlement theory of justice, and that's also the title of his article. So Nozick thinks that any theory of justice has three parts. So you have the original acquisition of holdings, the transfer of holdings, and the rectification of injustice in holdings. So a holding is basically like, what do you own? What do you have? So if we're talking about how you got what you had, in a theory of justice, in order to be entitled to have what you have, to have your holdings, you have to get them in legitimate ways. So that's part of what goes into a theory of justice of acquisition. Second, you have the transfer of holdings. So if you received a holding that was gotten unjustly, you are not entitled to keep that holding. Conversely, if you received a holding justly, then you are entitled to keep that holding. And finally, the rectification of injustice in holdings. Basically, if you got something unjustly, you need to make it right. You need to set things right if you've stolen or somehow acquired something in a way that was not fair. So when thinking about the original acquisition of holdings, ways that you can get something the wrong way, kind of, at an intuitive level, if you steal something, maybe if you make a lying agreement, if there's deceit involved in getting that thing, that might be a violation of of the transfer of holdings, like you cheat somebody to get what they have, or you get something through dishonest means. Those are ways in which you can violate just acquisitions, just ways of changing goods. And if you did those things, you would need to rectify the wrong that you've done. So what this means for Nozick is that the basis of justice in holdings, being just in what you possess, it's historical. And that means that it depends on what actually happened. So your entitlement to having what you have isn't based on some kind of quality or attribute about you, whether maybe you're smarter than people, or even if you're poorer than somebody else. Those qualities don't entitle you to have a certain thing. What makes it just for you to have a thing is that you got it in the right way. So at this point, Nozick doesn't fill out what exactly that means, but basically, to figure out if you have what you have by just means, you need to look at how you got it. And basically, someone's only entitled to have what they have by looking at how they got that thing. Okay, so then Nozick talks about why pattern distributions of wealth can be problematic. So basically, he thinks if you choose some type of quality that determines the pattern of how much wealth each person has, you run through a problem. So let's think about the example of Wilt Chamberlain. So I'm going to read a little bit of this passage from Nozick where he describes this situation. So he says, so Wilt Chamberlain, he's in demand, he signs a contract, and here's how this contract goes. In each home game, 25 cents from the price of each admission ticket goes to him. The season starts and people cheerfully attend the team's games. They buy their tickets, and each time they do, they drop a separate 25 cents of their admission into a box with Chamberlain's name on it. And then let's suppose in one season he had 1 million people come watch him play, and he ends up with $250,000, a much larger sum than the average income and larger than anyone else has. And so the thought is, in a pattern distribution, distribution of wealth, is he entitled to this extra income? Is he entitled to have what he has? So even though he lives in a society that has an equal distribution pattern of wealth, doesn't he still have a right to the wealth he accumulates, even if it makes him wealthier than others? And here's 2 reasons that Nozick gives why we should think that Chamberlain is entitled to that extra money. So people gave him their wealth of their own accord. So even in this equally distributed, wealth in this society, people they had their wealth and they chose to use it in the way that they saw fit. And second, Chamberlain and the team owners entered the contract freely. So there was nobody forcing anybody else to do anything. There was a free movement of agreement and of money. So it seems like, Nozick didn't do anything to cheat anybody out of anything. People spent their money as they saw fit. They spent their wealth on coming to see him play. And so it seems like he has this right to that money. And what Nozick points out is that if you're going to maintain a pattern distribution of wealth, you have to stop people from spending the money their own way, and you have to take people's money that they acquired through honest transfer. So basically, the government or whoever's overseeing this distribution, they have to interrupt the freedom of movement of money. So basically, people can't spend their money in their own way, and they can't keep their possessions in the ways that they desire to keep them. All right, so Nozick makes use of what's called acquisition. And Nozick adopts Locke's theory of acquisition. And what Locke's theory is basically anytime you apply your labor and your hard work to something, that thing becomes yours. Now, at this point, Locke is just thinking about, let's say you had a plot of land and you grew an apple orchard there, or you planted some corn. That piece of land is yours because you put your labor to it. You in some way made it maybe more valuable because of the effort you put into cultivating the earth. So you put your effort into making some property or thing that no one else claimed or possessed better. And that's basically how you acquire something. So applying labor basically, or mixing your labor in, it's basically using your work to make something better. And in some way, this makes that thing yours. Now, Locke does have another stipulation on acquiring resources justly. And basically, you shouldn't worsen the situation of others. And if your owning something puts others in a bad way or makes their situation worse, you are not acting justly and you do not have a right to own that thing. So think about when someone think about monopolies. Monopolies might not be just because it's one person controlling this scarce resource. So imagine you were on a desert island and, maybe there were a couple of wells on the island and all the other ones dried up except the one that you owned. So what would happen here is if you started charging people for that scarce resource, or you bought up all the other wells in the land, Locke would say that you're actually acting unjustly because a lot of times what happens when one person owns a resource and they start charging for it, it gives them a disproportionate advantage over somebody else. So if you're owning something, if it puts someone in a bad way or it makes their life situation worse, you're not acting justly. So Nozick says Locke's proviso that there be enough and as good left in common for others is meant to ensure that the condition of others is not worsened. So basically, our acquisition of something should not trample over top of other people. It shouldn't make their life worse. So here's some questions to think about from both Nozick and Rawls. Should a theory of justice advantage the poor, and in what way should it advantage the poor? And are there better and worse ways of doing this? So Rawls talked very abstractly about advantaging the poor in our social and economic policies, but what exactly does that mean? And might there be ways, again, of advantaging the poor that could actually hurt them in the long run? Also, what kinds of ways of getting and owning stuff puts others in our society at a disadvantage? If Nozick is right, and we're supposed to follow Locke in the way he thinks that acquisition happens, what ways of possessing items hurts others? Is it monopolies? Are there other things you could think of, other ways of owning property that put other people at a significant disadvantage? And finally, what are the strengths and weaknesses of each theory? Are there things that the authors didn't discuss that you think are important for a theory of justice? So remember that we are taking in new information. We're learning about new and different theories, but you don't have to take for granted that they're right. As you're reading, do you get the sense that maybe they're not talking about something that's important to justice that should be talked about? That's an important thing for us as philosophers to consider. We want our theory of justice to be as comprehensive as possible. And in trying to make sure that members of society are not disadvantaged, we want to make sure that we cover all the corners. So, what are the strengths and weaknesses that you see of each theory? Well, that is the end of this just summation of Nozick and Rawls' theory of justice, and I hope to see you for the next lecture.